Coming up next on the Wet Fly Swing podcast.
Spent the last 5 years of his life couch surfing and fishing with friends and getting sicker and sicker, and finally went out to stay with his son in Hawaii and go into hospice and die. And it was like, okay. It was just like, okay, this is what comes next, Great object lesson, because we're all going to be faced with that probably,
That was John Gierach on a story behind the final fishing days of a good friend. Tom McGuane, Ernest Hemingway, and John Gierach today on The Swing.
Welcome to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show, where you discover tips, tricks, and tools from the leading names in fly fishing today.
Hey, how you doing today? Thanks for stopping by the show. Stonefly Nets is back, giving out one of their bonus build-out giveaway events. We got it going right now, a custom-built, custom Stonefly net. Right now, you can get it. All you have to do is go to wetflyswing.com/giveaway, and we're going to be drawing a winner from that group. And then we're going to be doing the build-out, and a custom net is going to be coming your way step by step with Ethan. The great John Gierach is back on the podcast to dig back into some of his amazing books, including Dumb Luck and The Kindness to Strangers. We find out from John what makes a good guide. We also learn about how much a fly rod loves a dry fly, what rejection feels like, and how he deals with writer's block. This is another amazing one. It's been too long since we had John on, so excited to get this one back out there. We all know him and love him. Very happy to share this one with you today. Here we go. John Gierach. How you doing, John?
Doing well.
Thanks for making a little time to come on today and get caught up. We had you on. We'll put a link in the show notes to the episode. It was quite a while ago. I want to say it's been over 3 years since we had you on. And I want to get caught up on what you've been up to, because it seems like you've always got a book going. I think last time we talked, you said you might have had 2 books going. So we're going to get caught up on that. But just take us there. How's everything been for you? Give us the COVID rundown. Have you been getting out and traveling over the last few years? It probably slowed you down a little bit.
Well, it slowed the whole world down there for a couple of years, and I was no exception. I got out, any place I could drive to and be by myself and, stop and get gas outside with a credit card. And, there were ways to function, but I didn't get on an airplane for a couple of years.
Yep. And are you back at it now? Have you got some trips you've been going? You got some stuff planned?
Yeah. I traveled some last year, and I've got a few trips planned for this year, and there'll be probably more to come.
Nice. Well, I was thinking one way, last time we had you on, it was a great episode. We dug into a lot of your background, and I'll put a link to the show notes, like I said, to that episode. But I was thinking today we could just get caught up on where you're at. You've published a lot of books, and we've talked about that last time. But just giving us a quick update, have you forgotten how many books you published, or what's that look like?
Yeah, I have to remind myself every once in a while. I've published 21 fishing books, and there was way back in the 70s, there was a book of poetry, which most people long out of print. I don't know if you could, it's impossible to find, which may be for the best, I don't know. It was the best work I could do at the time, just put it that way.
Yep. And that's part of I'm sure you probably look at this as I do, it's about the body of your work, right? It's not about any single book, but you look back over the body. Is that kind of how you look at like your work as you look over the years of what you've done?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you add the phrase over the years, yeah, of course. Each book is like, it's a crucial thing. It's going to be your next book. And people ask, what's your favorite book? And I always say, well, it's either the one I just published or the one I'm working on. Because partly I just think that should be true. But, I like to think I'm getting better. So, so it's like this book that just came out, All the Time in the World. Actually, it isn't even officially really out yet. I think it's early next month is the pub date. But that's currently my favorite book, but I'm a little bit into the next one already. I finished these. Sweat, Blood, and Tears. Worked on it for 3 years. submit it to the publisher, and then there's all the copy editing and proofreading and proofs of galleys and back and forth, and finally it's done. And then I move on, right? And the book isn't going to come out for a year, and by the time the book's out, I've moved on, and I'm thinking about the next one.
Right.
So sometimes it's a real gear change when I start doing the first few interviews on a new book. I have to really kind of change gears and go, okay, wait a minute, that was a year ago.
Yeah, right. How do you keep, maybe you could describe it on this process all the time in the world, this new book, which will probably be out by the time this podcast goes live, but how is that one? Was the process different at all? Take us there a little bit, how this came to be.
No, I don't think the process was any different. There was a period of time I was doing a book every 2 years, and I usually have had a column going somewhere in some magazine, and so that is at least the genesis of material. Usually the column doesn't go in as a chapter, and I always know if I have trouble keeping a column to my word count, I just know, okay, I have more to say about this, so I sort of flag that one. And sometimes there'll be a chapter that's written expressly for the book. I like to try to get a new piece in there from time, here and there. And there's that year, that winter usually, when I just sit down and that's kind of all I do is go over the thing and figure out an order. What order do these go in? There's usually, I'm always in the back of my mind as I'm freelancing. Well, this is this has got the potential for being part of a book. So I'll get an order, settle on an order, and go through it and go, no, it's not right, and change it, and then I'll start at the beginning and rewrite it as a book instead of, just collected odds and ends. And sometimes that's easy, and sometimes it involves vast rewriting of things. And so that's kind of the process. And the theme is, the themes are always kind of the same. There's a lot of writers who just, they work on one theme for their entire careers, and I'm one of those guys. I don't know what the theme is. I mean, plainly stated, it's what the hell is going on, right?
Yeah, that is interesting because it's on your theme, right? It's hard to tell in any given book what the theme is. It's just, the stories are great. They're always great. But yeah, it's hard to say like this book, like for example, All the Time in the World. You wouldn't say there's like a theme to that book. Like you could just give us a headline.
I don't think so. An English professor might be able to dig one out for you. But, there's novelists who've written 15 or 20 novels, the theme of which is, I don't understand women, or I can't make a living, or, it's usually, the theme part usually isn't that deep. Somebody once famously synopsized Moby Dick as man fights whale, whale wins.
Yeah, right.
Right. So, the theme part really is, there's generally not that much to it.
Right. And obviously fly fishing is always a focus, but yeah, there's stories within, we'll probably get into a little bit today just on one of the books that I read, Dumb Luck and the Kindness of Strangers, which, it's probably very similar to All the Time in the World. Talk about that one. What was the timing on that? That's been a few years, right? Or do you remember when that one popped out?
That was 3 years ago.
Yeah.
It came out 3 years ago. I'd have to look at the copyright date, but yeah, it would have been 3 years ago.
3 years ago. Gotcha. Yeah, and I think, from that one, I took away a lot of, just kind of one-liners, right? Like things that just got me thinking. And I'm not sure, like, for example, let's just look at one. Like in that one, you talked about having a stringer, right? You were talking about, like one of the stories was talking about, your stringer for catching fish. That was one of the questions I was kind of thinking. Do you still have a stringer for your catch?
I do. I think that story was the last time I used it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's out. It's all hanging from a nail behind the side door in the garage. I could go get it right now if it wasn't 8 degrees out.
Exactly. But that's the cool. I think on the last one you told that story about how, can't remember who the writer was, but one of the famous writers described like pointing a gun and how his finger was so bent that it, if he pulled the trigger, it'd shoot his foot.
Yeah.
And you described that, but that's, you do the same thing, right? And that stringer was the same thing. It really painted that picture like, yes, I remember those metal stringers. I had one, or I probably still have one too. And so when you're writing, are you even thinking about that? Or does it just come naturally as far as how you're painting the picture as opposed to telling us something?
Well, I think about it in the sense that it's how I've taught myself to write, which is that you don't tell the reader, you show the reader.
Yeah.
That was a good example. The guy could have just said it was Roger Angell. He was an old New Yorker writer. And he could have said that he had crippling arthritis in his hands, but what he said was if he made a pistol with his thumb and forefinger, pointed it at your nose and pulled the trigger, he'd get you in the right knee.
Right. God, that's so much better.
Now you see it. I mean, that's better. And it actually also adds a layer, which is that he can see the humor in it. So he's not just complaining. I mean, he's telling you something and he's saying, well, I'm in my 90s and, I can live with it.
Yeah, exactly. So on the book, like you said, this book is coming out here right soon, within a month. It's been a while since you've written the book. Do you remember the stories well in that book, or are you thinking about the stories of this next book, whatever's coming out next right now?
I'm actually thinking about the story I'm working on right now, which is about a float I took on the Colorado River last September.
What was that? Take us there a little bit. Can you give us a little heads up on that trip, what we can expect from this in your next book? Or I'm assuming do you have one book that you're kind of working on right now?
Yeah. That's all I've got in me is one book at a time. There have been a few times way back when I was working more furiously where I'd stop between books and do fishing the high country or, a little monograph on bamboo rods or something. But no, there's just one book. What did you ask me?
So for the trip, the Colorado, I'm interested in this trip. So it sounds like it was a float trip on the Colorado?
Yeah, we just went over in September because over by a town called Silt, charmingly named Silt, where the Colorado comes out of its headwater canyons and it starts to get big and it starts to flatten out and it flows out across this sage country and across the Colorado Plateau, and it's good hopper fishing in the fall. And but of course now we've had wildfires for the last 2 years, and actually we didn't have that many last year, but previous years we did. So there are burn scars and mudslides, and the water's discolored now. It used to be crystal clear in September. So there's that, like the water's a little browner than it used to be, and people aren't going over there like they used to. So, but you can still fish it. So if there's a theme to that one, it's sort of making the best of, things change, but you can still make the best of them. And then I was with two guides who were guides, and it's always interesting to be in a boat with guides because they have a different, I think I said they were like jazz musicians. They always seem like they're in on a joke you'll never get. So there's that. And then there's the fact that the Colorado River is slowly drying up and everybody out west is fighting over the water. And we're up in the, not that we don't take plenty of water out of it, but we're up here where there's still water in it.
Yeah. You're not at the bottom where it doesn't make it out to the ocean anymore, right? Yeah. That's the interesting thing about that basin.
Yeah. Right, exactly. So, that's a little poignant subplot in there that you're fishing a river that's quite likely on the way out.
Yeah. How do you balance that in your writing? Because I know that's a big focus for you. Conservation issues are really important, obviously, and I know they're important for you. How do you, do you feel like you kind of do that subtly when you talk about some of these issues, or how does that look when overall, if you look at the kind of the body of your work when you do that? You could just take it to your most recent book you're working on now. Are you always thinking like, I got to get this conservation issue in and talk about it?
No, I don't think I have to get it in, but I want to talk about it when it's there to talk about. But I don't want to lecture.
Yeah.
I don't want to preach. The people who don't believe in climate change are not going to change their minds, although I think there's fewer and fewer of them as climate change gets right in our face. It's harder to say it isn't true. But I just want to talk about it. I want it to be part of the story, because it is part of the story. When I first started reading outdoor stories back in the 50s, early 60s, Field and Stream, Outdoor Life, all those guys, most of those stories took place in this kind of timeless fantasy land where nobody had to worry about a job, nobody had marital problems. You know what I mean? It was just, there was always an Indian guide, there was always a bottle of whiskey. Whatever else happened, they always ended up catching fish. They always ended up getting their buck. And it was just kind of unbelievable. And then people like Tom McGuane came along and wrote about it like it really is. And that was a revelation to me. It was like, yeah, you can be honest about this. You can put it in the context of real life, and it makes it fuller. It makes it more real. It makes it closer to something like literature, because now you're not only talking about fishing, you're talking about the human condition.
Exactly. And McGuane was that was one of the first people. He's obviously been a big influence, but that was one of the first people that showed you that.
No, he wasn't the first. The first was probably Ernest Hemingway. I remember, first time I read Big Two-Hearted River I was probably 13, and I thought it was just a story of a fishing trip with what at the time was written in the 20s, with like antique tackle, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I read it again at 16. I thought, oh, yeah, there's more to this. This guy's all by himself, and he's not really talking to anybody. And then at some point, it all starts to become obvious. Like, this guy's, he's back from the First World War. He's got what they used to call shell shock, but now we call PTSD. And he's gone fishing to think things over, but he's not droning on about the stuff he's thinking over. He's just talking about the fishing, but he drops in these little things. Like there's a swamp on this river where the fishing's really good, but he doesn't want to go in there because he doesn't like the looks of the swamp. And there's just these subtle little things. And pretty soon you read it again at like 25 and it breaks your heart, but you don't quite know why. I go back and read that story every couple of years, and I still haven't figured out how he did that. Everybody who likes fishing stories should read that.
I'm glad you brought that one up, because that is a good, I was thinking about picking your brain on starting the John Gierach book club, right? Get some good books that we should all be reading. So that's definitely one we're going to add to the list. Yeah,
that's a short story, and it's in with there's that whole section of Michigan stories that are pretty autobiographical and, up in Michigan stuff, and all pretty good. But that was by far the best, I thought.
Perfect. You mentioned guides earlier, and I know, you definitely go on some guide trips around and you do a little on your own as well. And you kind of talked about the inside joke with the guides. What is your experience? I mean, you must have had some great guides over the years. I know I used to do a little bit of guiding. I know how hard it is. It's and some people are, I think, just made for it. What is that? You talked about the inside joke. Do you find that on all your years of the guides that sometimes you find really great ones and sometimes maybe not as great? And what makes a great guide, do you think?
Well, the joke is there's nothing better than a good guide or worse than a bad one, right?
Mm-hmm.
A good guide is not only knows his stuff, knows the river, knows the hatches and all that stuff, but he can read people. A lot of guides, I've only been out with one or two or three really bad guides, like really people who shouldn't be guiding. Can't row a boat, don't know how to fish. That's really rare. Those guys get weeded out immediately. But mediocre guides, and there's a lot of those, they just play the same game on everyone, right? Yeah. They treat every client the same, whether he's a 16-year-old who's never fished before or an old geezer like me who's fished for longer than he's been alive. And they typically play to the lowest common denominator, so they're always yelling set when you get a strike, and they're constantly talking. But the good guides, Angus Drummond is the guy my friend Ed and I were fishing with on the Colorado in September. And Angus he knows Ed. They've worked together. And Ed's a guide too, so that's taken care of. But he just sussed me out in 10 minutes. And it was like, not that I don't need any help. Right. Everybody needs some help. But it was just like, okay, he knows where to cast. He knows how to cast. He knows where to cast. He knows what to do. And so it was just, he would say, okay, try this little, he'd point out spots that might not be immediately obvious, or every once in a while he'd say, let me change out your dropper or something like that. But, because he knows the hatches and I don't. But, mostly, then you just end up talking about local history and politics, and sometimes you get comfortable enough that you just stop talking. Just like you three guys out in a boat, everybody knows what they're doing. The weather's beautiful, the river's beautiful. What is there to say,
Yeah, that's it. I mean, you just described it, right? The guide's good enough to know when to talk and when to not talk, right? So he's not sitting there just jibber-jabbering the whole time. He's actually letting you enjoy where you are in these amazing places and giving you tips, like you said.
Well, I was out with a guy in Wisconsin, and I should remember his name. I'll remember it maybe as I tell the story. But his deal, he had a shtick. He told jokes all day long. And they weren't all good jokes, but some of them were good.
Yeah.
And at first you go, okay, I don't know if I'm going to like this or not. And of course, if there was something to say about the fishing, he'd say it. And I don't mean it was nonstop, and at the end it was like, that was it was kind of like spending a day in a boat with Buddy Hackett or somebody. But it's not like you long to go out and do it again the next day. So, every once in a while there's somebody who's just, I've been out a couple of times with this guy who, guides always say, well, the only thing the guide can really control is what's for lunch. And so this guy would do these just fabulous lunches. It's just gourmet lunches. And it was like, okay, that maybe the fishing was good, but maybe it wasn't. But, lunch is going to be great. And so that was kind of his thing. And so there's room for creativity, God knows. I mean, and some of the old guides I fished with in Labrador when I first started going up there, they wouldn't say 5 words all day. I mean, they'd, in the morning they'd say, get in the boat. And they'd motor you somewhere and they'd say, fish here. And if they'd watch you, and if they didn't think you were a good fisherman, they'd go take a nap. And if they thought you knew what you were doing, they'd stand there with the net. And then at lunchtime, they'd say, let's eat. And I mean, that was it.
Yeah.
You'd say, what fly should I use? And he'd say, well, you're the fisherman.
Mm-hmm. This is for the brook trout?
Yeah. So, and I kind of like that too. It's like this one guy said, yeah, I'm the guide, but, if somebody comes up here to fish and they don't know how to fish, that's not my problem, eh?
Right. That's pretty good. But if they get a beginner, that would be, I guess people coming up to Labrador probably aren't too many beginners, I'd imagine.
Oh, it happens.
Yeah.
It does happen. And that's changed. I got in on the kind of the last of those laconic old Northwoods guys who were just kind of owly and, reclusive. And the guides now it's a new generation. They're younger and, they still kind of assume you know how to fish. But if you don't, they'll say, okay, look, let me show you. And, they don't have the whole educational trip down like some do, but they'll say, well, look, hold it like this.
Yeah. What about that? Do you like the history? Do you like the, you're on the river, you're on the water, and somebody is just like a, PhD in the history of the river and the canyon and the species? Do you love somebody filling you in on that when you're out there?
I do. My only problem is trying to take notes and fish at the same time.
Yeah.
But I'm always kind of aware that I'm a fisherman, but I'm also a writer, and it's the writing that pays the bills. So I'll reel in. I mean, if it gets, if it gets really interesting and there's stuff I want to get down, I'll reel in and get out the notebook. But what I prefer to do is like back at the lodge in the evening, I'll go find a guy and I'll say, okay, what was the name of that river? What was that volcano? Whatever it is. Now, I try to get that stuff on site, if only because some of this stuff, you're only going to get it on site. I mean, you're only going to get the correct spelling of something like Chiganagat volcano.
Yeah.
If you're standing there looking at it. And you go back to the lodge and there's a map and you say, okay, that's how you spell it. There's some things you just can't look up online.
Today's episode is sponsored by Trxstle, who has earned an exceptional reputation over the past few years in the fly fishing industry due to the popularity of their telescopic fly rod roof racks and statement-making artist series apparel lines. Their latest release for 2023 is the Gierach Universal Bike Rack Packing System, a brand new way to transport your fly fishing and outdoor gear. The Gierach will give any modern bike the ability to bring 30 pounds of gear with its front and rear articulated racks. Whether you ride a full suspension mountain bike, an e-bike, or even a carbon fiber road bike, the Gierach will get you and your fishing gear further faster and have much more fun along the way. I can tell you this has been a big struggle for me. I've been riding my bike, both road bikes and mountain bikes, and had lots of issues over the years packing my gear, whether that's crappy storage on the back or a trailer that's just too big and bulky. So I'm excited to share this packing system, which is going to make it way more convenient and accessible to get out to the places you need to go. You can learn more about how Trxstle is transforming the way you access your favorite water, backcountry hunting zones, and camping spots. Head over to wetflyswing.com/Trxstle right now and be the first on the water and the farthest upstream and away from the crowds. That's Trxstle, Trxstle. Trxstle, live your pursuit. I mentioned at the beginning, Dumb Luck and the Kindness of Strangers was a book that came out a few years ago, and it's one that I've been reading lately, and you had a couple of interesting kind of notes I made. And one of them you said, and I was going to ask you, is how much does a fly rod love a dry fly? That was a quote you had in there. So describe that a little bit. How much do you think a fly rod loves a dry fly? What did you mean by that?
Well, I just think that fly fishing was basically invented for dry flies. And I mean, there was a Roman historian. His name was Marcus Aelianus. I write about him in the new book. And This was in something like the 3rd century, and he wrote about some fishermen. It's kind of not clear exactly where they were because all the names have changed. But they were fishing for these speckled fishes, which I take to be trout, and the fish were eating bugs floating on the surface. And they couldn't use the bugs themselves as bait. They couldn't thread them on a hook. So they tied wool and feathers on hooks to mimic the bugs, the right color wool. And maybe they waxed them, maybe they didn't, but they fished that and caught the fish. And that's the first, supposedly, according to John MacDonald, that's the first written mention of fly fishing anywhere, at least in the English language. So I just always thought, well, yeah, it started out as dry flies. And even when I started fishing in the 60s and early 70s, there were wet flies and there were streamers, but, nymph fishing was, I remember the first story I tried to sell on nymph fishing, and the editor of the magazine rejected it, and he said, we don't do that.
Wow.
We don't put weight on our leaders.
Right.
That isn't done. And, 3 years later, he's calling me up and going, well, you know how to nymph fish. Why don't you write me a story about it?
Right.
But, for the longest time, it was just dry flies, essentially, or you're fishing within an inch or two of the surface, and nobody weighted flies. And
right. The good old days, right?
Well, it was the good old days, and actually, Lee Wolf's idea of dry flies is he said, well, fish deserve the sanctuary of deep water. He saw it as a conservation thing. So if fish do 80% of their feeding under the surface, that means you're going to catch 20% of the fish, or you're going to catch fish 20% of the time, and that should be good enough.
That's a great point. Did you know Lee Wolf? Yeah. Did you talk to him? Know him? I'm not sure. I
can't say I knew him, but I met him a few times. We talked. We had dinner together once, and he was an intense guy. And I don't know. I'm a little. I can get a little hinky around intensity. You know what I mean? I'm pretty laid back.
Oh yeah. Hinky being like if somebody's super intense, you're going to kind of let them know.
No, I'm not going to let them know. I'm just going to kind of sit back and let them be intense, but I'm not going to join them in it.
Oh, right. Yeah. And what do you mean by intense?
Well, by kind of having all the answers and assuming you don't have any of them. I don't mean Lee specifically, but
sure.
Guys like that tend to think, okay, well, I know and you don't. So you just tend to, and if you sit back and sip your coffee and let them talk, pretty soon they'll get it wrong. And you don't have to point it out, but you just smile to yourself and you go, yeah, well, you don't know it all.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's it. That's kind of how I do it too. I tend to, be subtle about it. Like there's no reason those people, some people like that, you don't have to tell them. I mean, it's obvious to anybody around, right? When that situation happens. So you mentioned rejection. I'm guessing you haven't been rejected too many times in your writing, but was that like that one example you gave us? How did that feel, and have you had to deal with that? And how have you dealt with rejection?
Well, if you're going to be a freelance writer, you develop a thick skin early. You just do, because you're going to get rejected. And, I got rejected plenty when I started writing. I mean, I had no idea what I was doing. I kind of got spoiled because I actually sold the first fishing story I ever submitted, but not necessarily the second or third.
Right. Do you remember that story, who you sold it to, or what was the story?
I remember I sold it to Fly Fisherman magazine. I think that's when they were still in St. Louis. I think it was still the original guys that started it. And I remember it was in 1975 or 6. I actually have a ledger of all the stuff I've sold. I could go back and find it. But I don't actually remember what it was.
Maybe we can look it up for you. We'll dig it. We'll talk to we'll see. That'd be great to have that, right? I always wonder about that with the magazines. You got all this body of work, the same thing we talk about, but you can't. Sometimes it's hard to find these older articles, which I'm sure are great, right?
I don't know how great they are. Some of this. Sometimes I've been writing for almost half a century now, and people ask me that. Don't you wish you could go back and see some of that earlier stuff? And sometimes I think, maybe it's best that's just gone.
Right. So you're better. So you're a better writer, much better writer than you were in 1975.
God, I hope so.
Yeah. So you're not born great at this thing.
I don't think so. Maybe somebody is, but even Hemingway struggled, and everybody's got stories of their early struggles and piles of rejection slips, and you just, you send a story to somebody and they send it back. It's not like your English teacher. They're not going to say, okay, this is a C- paper and here's what's wrong with it. They're just going to go, yeah, we don't want it.
Right. Nobody's going to buy it.
And they're not going to critique it. And so it's just basically somebody going, this isn't good enough.
How do you figure that out over time? So how do you know the stuff that's, you really know that isn't that good and the stuff that is? Does it, I guess people are buying it or not, but do you know when you're writing it after you're completed, you're like,
Yeah, you do eventually. I think the thing you do is you read voluminously. You read lots and lots of good books. And you just develop a sense of what good writing looks like. And you don't, sometimes, I've got a few writers, some of Hemingway, almost all of Alice Munro, some of Annie Dillard, a lot of Tom McGuane, some of Jim Harrison, that I just go back and read and still haven't quite put my finger on either. Sometimes it's what they're doing, sometimes it's why they're doing it or how it works or why it works. I tend to be fascinated by that, by writers who can, make you feel certain ways, but you go, well, where exactly in the story is it that they accomplished that? But then John McPhee, in a book called Draft Number 4, pretty much answers that. He just said, it's detail. He said 1,000 details combined to make a single impression. And the implication is you can't put your finger on detail number 873 and say that was the one that did it. It's just this cumulative effect.
Right. Yeah, that's awesome. And this is great. We're on this. We had a question, or Lane Forer, who's a writer, and he was on our podcast a while back, and he noted he used one of your quotes. I don't have it in front of me, but he used one of your quotes. I think he even asked you for if he could do it in his book. And I asked him, do you have a question for John? I told him you're coming on. He wanted to ask, what do you see as the true success in writing? What do you see as true success in writing when you look back at what you've done?
Well, I want to say quality writing. That's what I want to say. But the fact is, I think true success for me was making a living at it. And, I know that sounds mercenary, but in a way, it's not, because to be a good writer, I think you have to do it for a living. I think you have to do it all the time, or at least full time. Maybe not all the time. You need breaks. And the only way you can do that is make a living at it. And so that's why it's not good that, there's this whole internet thing where information wants to be free. Actually, no, information wants to be paid for, because otherwise, if it's free, you get what you pay for, which was nothing. So it's some guy in his mother's basement making the shit up.
Yep.
And so there's a lot to be said for writers, novelists, musicians, artists, making a living.
Yeah, there is. There's a big difference. And Lane's going to love that answer because he is, it isn't his full-time job, but that's his goal. I asked him what his goal was, and that was it. And he talked about how, he's reading your stuff, right? He's read all your stuff. And so, you've been influenced by Tom, McGuane and all these people, and now you're influenced. Do you see that, like, out there, your influence on all these new writers that are going to be full-time people eventually? How does that feel, and do you see that out there?
I do see it. I hear from people. This afternoon, I'm going to go down and do a signing at the
nice
fly fishing show in Denver. It's likely that somebody will come up to me and say, well, I want to be a writer, or I'm a beginning writer. What's your advice? And, yeah, I'm aware of it. I don't know. There's always this, I just read an article in the New Yorker about the impostor syndrome, where, when you become successful, you almost have this sense that you fooled somebody, because it's still just you. It's just the same guy that used to get rejection letters is now getting checks, and the work has gotten better, and that. But when somebody says, somebody in their 20s comes up and says, "What should I do?" I go, "Geez, I don't want that to be my responsibility, man." If he looks up to me and I give him advice, he's going to follow it. And that's a big responsibility. Plus, when I started out, there was no internet, there was no websites, there were no podcasts. There was none of, It was all in print. It was all through the mail. So it was all different. People ask, how you got started? I say, well, I can tell you how I got started in 1970. But that's not going to do you any good, because it's a whole new world. And if nothing else, back then they understood they had to pay for the work. Nobody wanted you to work for free. Think of the exposure. And so at least, and a lot of magazines didn't pay well, but if you could write enough, you could still make a living.
Yeah, it's a different world definitely now. And that's why it's a great point, is that people, I guess it's the same thing though, right? You got to keep writing. And once you finish that book, start your next book. Would that be a good advice for somebody out there, just to keep writing and don't get too excited on that first successful or published book?
Yeah, that would be a good piece of advice. And, when you get a story rejected, a lot of writers will just turn around and send it to another magazine. But it's probably smarter to sit down and look at it and go, well, okay, this was rejected for a reason. Publications need material, even if it's only to fill the space between advertising in their minds. But, there's a standard. There's a basic standard of quality that they have to hold up. And so you go, okay, what was wrong with this? And on a computer now, back in the days of typewriters, it was a pain in the ass. But on computers now, you just call up the file and start editing, and go, well, I could be more descriptive here. I could be less descriptive there. I could be more specific here. I could, actually, when I just as a random example, I talk about trees here. Maybe I should find out what kind of trees they were. I talk about minnows. Maybe I should find out what species of minnow there were. Details. But I think editing your own work, reading other people's good work, pretty soon, if you're cut out for it at all, I think I don't believe in God-given talent or anything. I think you can learn to do most things, but if it's something that you're predisposed to do, I think you pick it up, but it takes work. It really does take an awful lot of work. I still agonize over it.
Right. You still get writer's block?
Absolutely. Although I think I don't believe in writer's block as such. I think it's just you either didn't really have anything to say, or you don't have enough information. You have to go back and learn more about your subject or something. I mean, if you get stuck, because every once in a while I get stories that just literally write themselves because I've got everything I need. I know how I feel about them. But, I wrote a story about, it's also, I think that was actually in the last book, about my friend Paul who died. And he got sick, and we went fishing for the last time, and it was just all he could manage to do to catch his last couple of trout. And I started that story, I don't know how many times, and I just couldn't do it. It just it wasn't right. I would get a couple of paragraphs in, and I go, no, this isn't any good. And finally, it was just, I had this revelation. It was like this voice said, dude, this story is not about you. And as soon as I figured that out, I just sat down and wrote it. And I mean, I went back and made some edits and stuff, but I mean, it just basically came out in one draft. It was his story. It wasn't my story. It wasn't how I felt. It was his story.
Yeah. And that was in Dumb Luck and the Kindness of Strangers. I remember that one, and it was really, it was pretty powerful because you talked about Paul and how, he was dealing, I think it was cancer, and he was on his last legs, right? And but he made it out on this trip, the final trip, and you talked about it, you described it, and you felt like you could be in Paul's shoes, kinda. I mean, that's kind of what you mean? Like you actually talked about it from his perspective a little, or at least you could see a little bit of what maybe that feels like.
Well, I actually talked about it from my perspective because I have no idea what his perspective was like. I can only extrapolate. But I was telling his story. And so I could be, instead of a grieving friend, I'm just a reporter. And it also let me, because he was a hilariously funny guy. He was truly a strange, weird little guy from northern Michigan. And very smart.
Yeah, with the old pickup, right? He had this old pickup he was trying to make sure he was taking care of everything.
Yeah, I gave him my old pickup when I bought a new one. And, I don't really know what more to say about that. But, it gave me, since it's his story from my perspective, it gave me a chance to tell you how funny he was and how he had these just kind of weird attitudes and, fell on hard times, but never really let it bother him much somehow. And, spent the last 5 years of his life couch surfing and fishing with friends and getting sicker and sicker, and finally went out to stay with his son in Hawaii and go into hospice and die. And it was like, okay. It was just like, okay, this is what comes next, Great object lesson.
Yeah.
Because we're all going to be faced with that probably,
No, it is. It's one of the one things, right? We all have the same amount of time every day, and we're all going to die. So it's more about how you live your life, I guess. And I think that's something we talked about earlier about your life. I think part of the reason you got into what you do is you saw your dad, right? Where he loved fishing, but didn't get out as much. And now you've made your life, you built your life around fly fishing. When you look back at it, do you just kind of pinch yourself sometimes and think, or do you look at it more like, hey, I put my work in to get here?
Well, I actually don't look back that much unless someone like you turns me around and says, hey, old man, look behind you. I don't care what you do. Moments are going to come when you think, geez, maybe I should have done something else. Everybody thinks that, I'm convinced.
Yeah. Like what? Like you could have been president of the United States or something like that.
No, but I could have gone straight and made money, and I don't know what I'd have done. I could have been a college professor. I studied philosophy in college. I could be a guy, with a tweed jacket and a striped tie, thinking deep thoughts and writing books that were considered great, but nobody read. But geez, I've had so much fun, and the work's been fun. And even if it wasn't fun at the time, it's fun to think about now. People come to me, young writers come to me, and they're kind of desperate, and I go, yeah, I used to be desperate. Now I'm just tired.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I think I made the right decision. I mean, I spent most of my life doing what people say they want to do when they retire, which is write their memoirs and go fishing a lot. And I did that stuff when I was young enough that I could still do a lot of stuff that I can't do now. I mean, I do the really crazy-ass, strenuous stuff. And I learned how to write, so the memoirs can be pretty good.
Yeah. That's awesome. And I kind of remember the quote you just reminded me that Lane Forer had. I think the one he used was something about, with fly fishing, you have to be old enough to be good at it, but you have to be like a kid to really enjoy it, or something like. Do you remember that quote you had somewhere along the way? I
don't exactly, but it was somebody was talking about baseball. They said it takes an old man to appreciate it, but it takes a kid to think it's important. Something like that.
And it's so true.
Yeah, and fly fishing, I think, is like that. Maybe even writing.
Yeah. Another from Dumb Luck and the Kindness of Strangers. Another one I pulled out of there that I thought was really interesting was you said, "How has vanity lost its grip on you over time?" You mentioned that. You said that in the book. So does that? I'm not even sure what that means exactly. Do you remember that? What does that mean to you?
Oh, that's just a young man, old man thing. I mean, at some point you just care less about how you look to the rest of the world. But it doesn't ever completely. I was talking about, we were at a place and we'd done some really good fishing. And I tied some flies that were like, really, they were the fly. Every once in a while, you show up with flies you've tied, and it works better than anything. And you catch lots of big fish. And we were getting ready to leave the next morning, and this father and son showed up, and they were asking how the fishing had been, and I gave them some of these flies. And the camp manager came over and said, yeah, those are good flies. Those really killed them this week. And I got this flush of vanity, and that's what prompted that. It's that, it loosens its grip as you get older, but it never entirely lets go.
Right. It still feels good. It still feels good to know, in whatever it is, that you got it. You still got it.
Yeah, exactly. Nick Lyons said a great thing about fish books. He said, the best fishing stories aren't really about fishing. And I think that's true.
Right.
I think they're always about the good ones. Always about something to do with the human condition that's pretty universal. Which is why I actually have a few readers who don't fish. They just like the books. I don't think there's thousands of them, but I hear from them every once in a while. I used to hear from this old lady in Vermont. I haven't heard from her in years. I think she died. But she wrote to me once and she said, I don't fish, but I like your books because you're such a pisser. Pissa, you'd say.
What is that? What is a pissa?
A pisser is, a smart ass, somebody that doesn't, isn't too diplomatic, willing to say what they mean regardless of how people think of it. And in the Northeast, you would be a pissa. Gotcha.
Yeah, I was just thinking, you mentioned the book Writing Not About Fishing, and the book that comes to my mind is just, a river runs through it, right? Because that was the whole concept of that movie. And obviously it's like the greatest fly fishing movie of all time, right? And all that. But that was basically the concept, is like, yeah, it was not about fly. In fact, the author, right? I mean, that was his whole thing. Like, everybody thought it was a fly fishing movie, but it was really about all this other stuff. Family.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Do you remember, that's always a fun one because it was such an influence. Do you remember that when that movie kind of came out, that whole thing?
I do. I have a different opinion about that than a lot of people. A lot of people thought that's what made fly fishing popular, was that movie. Less so the book, sadly. But I think that the movie was one of the rare instances of a movie that was as good as, if not a little better than the book. And that doesn't happen very often. The only other movie I can think of is the film version of Annie Proulx's The Shipping News. The movie might have been slightly better. But I always thought with The River Runs Through It, that people said that, well, that's what made fly fishing popular. And I always thought, no, fly fishing had gotten popular enough on its own that Robert Redford could make that movie and sell it. But it doesn't matter. But I think it certainly didn't hurt the popularity of fishing. I think it's what maybe made fishing fashionable.
Yeah, definitely did something. I'm not quite sure. Yeah, it had an impact, a major impact. So, I mean, looking again, this could be like the body of your work, but really just your fly fishing, as you look out, and I was kind of thinking this, like, where are you going next? How do you choose like the next place? But do you look at it where you have kind of challenges or places, fish, species, all that stuff you want to hit? Are you more like, I've done it all, I'm just kind of good, I'll take whatever the next big trip is that feels good?
Yeah, it's more the latter. I think more about the place. I think more about the people I'll be with. In August, I've been going to this lodge, Three Rivers Lodge in Labrador. I think I've been there 12 or 13 times.
Wow. Over
20-some years, 25 years maybe. And I just like the people. I like the place. I like the people. I'm going with Jim Babb, who's the former editor of Gray's Sporting Journal. He and I are friends, and we're shirt-tail relatives. We're distant cousins, twice removed. Babb's great company, and that just so happens to be arguably the best brook trout fishing in the world also. But we're going late in the season, and the fishing's harder. Then the fish are spread out more. They're harder to find. They're a little smarter because it's a vast area, but they have been fished for. But the thing is, they're as big as they're going to get, and they're in spawning colors. And we're talking about 4, 5, 6, 7 pound brook trout.
Dang.
And so you don't catch very many. Day will go by when you don't catch one. But when you catch one, it's like, holy crap, look at this thing.
Wow.
And it's almost, not to sound stuck up, but it's almost connoisseurs fishing. Like if you're into body counts, don't go.
No, it's like steelhead fishing.
Yeah, exactly. It's like steelhead. If you're not going to be happy with one beautiful fish, then you need to just go catch bluegills or, yeah. I don't know, silver salmon in September in Alaska where you can catch 60 fish. And
you get tired of it. Yeah. So how are you guys doing that? What's the technique? Are you on the on dries, or how are you catching these guys?
Boy, that's the big thing. Like, what are they eating? The big hatches are over, but there are still hatches. Depends on the weather. But if the weather isn't screaming ugly, there can be caddis hatches and mayfly hatches. If you see fish, it's the old thing. If you see them rising, you fish like dries and droppers to them. But one of the reasons they get big is they eat a lot of minnows. So there's a lot of streamer fishing, and there's some nymph fishing, and you just, that's the challenge. You find some fish, maybe you can see them, maybe you just think they're there, and then you try this and that, and if you get something that connects, you'll catch a fish or two, and they'll be big and beautiful, and you'll be real happy, and you go back and have a nice dinner at camp and try to warm up, because up in August up there, it's like October here.
Oh, right. Yeah. Sounds like a great trip. So I wanted to just take it out. I keep coming back to the spey thing because I know it's kind of a passion of mine, and steelhead and stuff like that. But how has that been for you? Are you still excited about, because some of that is, you're in the cold for steelhead, but are you still looking ahead saying, hey, I'm going to get some steelhead trips in, and talk about that? And then also, how is your spey game looking these days?
Well, I got to think it's a little rusty because I haven't done it in quite a while. It was before COVID. It was the last time I fished a spey rod. I think I could, 15 minutes on the water, I could get my chops back. But I don't know, the steelhead runs hadn't been good. And a friend of mine last summer, he said, getting into steelhead fishing now is like falling in love with a dying woman.
Damn.
And I thought, that's right. Maybe I should think about spey casting for something else. Sea run char.
Brook trout.
Sea trout. Well, it's, I'd love to, but...
The short spey.
Yeah, maybe. A friend of mine, the artist C.D. Clark, was up there one year with it was either a short spey or a switch rod, and it really just wasn't amenable. The water just isn't
not big enough.
Isn't like that. It's not big enough, and it's really rough water, most of it, because you're pretty high up the drainage. So I just never thought. I mean, every once in a while you come to a spot, and you go, yeah, this would be a great spey run, but then you just use a one-handed spey. The cast is kind of the same. It's just with a 9-foot rod, you don't get the distance.
Yeah. No, it's great. I think that's the cool thing about spey. It's like it's not just a two-handed thing anymore. There's all sorts of different ways. Just like fly fishing, you don't have to fish a Catskills dry fly, right? There's a lot of different ways to fish a dry fly.
Right.
Out there.
Right.
So, John, I want to take away one last kind of note I had here from, I think this was from the Dumb Luck book. But it was, you mentioned like just fly fishing. I think this was in general. And you said like it's less like a mugging and more like a con game. I think you were describing fly fishing. Maybe like, can you talk about that quote? Do you remember that one?
I do. I'm not sure I remember the context, but I mean, elk hunting is like a mugging. Fly fishing, the fish are doing something, and you sneak in and you try to make them think that your fly is like the one they're eating. It's the ones they're eating. So you're trying to fool them. And it's like a con game. It's like, hey, you want to make a lot of money real easy, and the fish goes, yeah, okay, and you go, ha, gotcha.
Yeah. Would fishing with bait be more like a mugging, or is that still more like a con game?
Well, it's probably a little of both. Fishing with bait. I mean, my dad was a big lure guy. He always wanted to. He would fish however he had to catch fish. But he always said, lures are better because you fooled the fish. He said, you put a worm on and you haven't fooled the fish. That's really a worm.
Right.
And I always remembered that. It's like, yeah, it's better to throw out this plastic thing that's supposed to look like a minnow, and the fish thinks it's a minnow and eats it.
Yeah, you're right. It's way better. Yeah, instead of tasting and smelling, right? Feeling like an actual thing or the actual thing. Nice, John. Well, give us a heads up in the next, I guess looking out, you got the one book. That's really what you're focused on, right? By the time this episode goes out here in the next month, it'll probably be live. So is that basically all you're focusing on? Well, I guess you're focusing on your next book too.
Yeah, well, right now I'm going to be doing some book promotion. The book, by the way, I have to say this is called All the Time in the World. And it's by Simon & Schuster. You can get it anywhere. But yeah, I'm going to do promotion for that for a while. Probably do some appearances and some Zoom stuff, and then I'm planning fishing for next year, this next season, and I'm working on the next book, and more of the same.
Perfect. Well, we're excited to see more of the same, and can't wait to check out the new book. We'll put links to everything in the show notes so people can pick it up directly. And yeah, John, just appreciate your time again today. Give us an update. This has been a lot of fun, and looking forward to hopefully getting you on again when maybe get that next book out there.
You bet. I'll be here.
So there it is. Boom. The sound of John Gierach dropping the mic as he walks off the stage. Wetflyswing.com/434. 434. If you want to check out some of John's recent books, get links out to those, whatever you want to check out. We got it all. We're going to have some good links there, including hopefully a video or two. A quick reminder, the Stonefly custom build, the custom build out bonus right now. This is the custom wood fly fishing net. Ethan's going to be selecting one winner from people who enter. That could be you. Go to wetflyswing.com/giveaway right now and find out how to enter to win this. Really easy. Just enter your email. And if you win, we'll be announcing it here on this podcast. Quick listener shout out before we get out of here today. Joseph Williams. We're giving a shout out to Joseph Williams, who actually was on the live event we had when we did the Euro nymphing giveaway. And we announced on that event, we gave away a few bonus products. And one of those was a Maverick fly rod, Euro nymphing rod. And Joseph won that fly rod. Shout out to Joseph for attending the live event. If you want to check that out, you can go anytime right now, wetflyswing.com/live, LIVE, and you can find out which event we have going. And you can join it. Even if you don't enter to win the big trip, there still is an opportunity to win some bonus items that we always offer. So shout out to Joseph Williams. Congrats, Joseph. Hope you are enjoying that fly rod. So that's all we have for you today. I'm going to get out of here and hope you are going to get out there on the water. And if you do, definitely reach out to me anytime, Dave at WetFlySwing. Thanks for stopping by today, and I hope you're having a great afternoon, great evening, or great morning wherever you are in the world. And I appreciate you for stopping by today.
Thanks for listening to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show. For notes and links from this episode, visit wetflyswing.com.